Hey, I want you to grab your Bible or your tablet or your phone, open up the Bible app, whatever. I want to take you through a little bit of a history lesson as we jump into opening our series on Elijah this morning. And so it's going to require you to hopefully follow along because there's some names, number one. But number two, it's going to help set up some context of where we are in the book of 1 Kings. And so if you do have a Bible or an app or a tablet and you can open up that, go to 1 Kings chapter 15. 1 Kings chapter 15 is where we are this morning. I want to set it up this way. So I don't know how much you know or understand of history in the Old Testament. And so I want to give you a bit of a summary and just to walk through it so hopefully you can understand some of the context with Elijah. So as the nation of Israel was formed, they went through a season where they had some judges, but the people wanted a king. And I don't know if you realize that or not, but they wanted a king, and they chose their first king, a guy named Saul. And so maybe you've heard of King Saul, but he was the first king over Israel, and he reigned somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 years. And after King Saul, the next king that came was King David, who is probably one of the more familiar kings that we know of. And King David reigned for about 40 years, and then David's son reigned, and his name is Solomon, and we give Solomon the credit of being the wisest man who ever lived. And of course, he wrote most of the book of Proverbs, all of that type of stuff. And so each of those guys reigned somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 years. And so for about 120 years, Israel was united as one kingdom under those three kings. And then things go a little sideways because there's the next guy that becomes king is a guy named Rehoboam. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Rehoboam, but Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. And as Rehoboam comes to become king, he is counseled by his father's advisors. And his father's advisors tell him, they say, look, Rehoboam, your father was very hard on the people. He was a hard taskmaster, so to speak. And they basically tell him, they say, listen, Rehoboam, if you will just go easy on the people, they will follow you. They will follow you. You will be their king. And you can reign for just about as long as you want to if you'll just provide a little bit of a relief for them. And so Rehoboam takes a moment and he goes to his own friends, guys maybe that are his own age, and he asks them what they think. And they all come to this place and they say this to the Solomon's advisors. They go, listen, if you thought my father was hard on the people, you haven't seen anything yet. And what I am about to do, it will be so much worse than the way my father was on you. And it was in that moment that the nation of Israel really embarked upon what we would call a civil war. And the nation split into two kingdoms. They had the kingdom in the north. The north was the nation of Israel. And then the south was the nation of Judah. And the south in the nation of Judah is where Rehoboam would reign for a little bit. But then it was also one of those things that they lasted for about 300 years. And for 300 years, they had 17 different kings. And only 8 of those kings were kings that would lead the people back to following the Lord's commands. And so over those 300 years, they had these little pockets of time where there would be a king and he would rise to power or he would inherit the throne. And as he inherited the throne, he would lead the people back to worshiping God and God alone. And then somebody else would become king and he might lead the people astray, and then this other one. And so that was going on in the nation of Judah. In the nation of Israel, which was the northern kingdom, they existed after this civil war. They existed for about 200 years. They had 19 different kings over 200 years, and not one of those kings was the type of king that would lead the people back to worshiping God and God alone. In fact, the way that they'd be described in the scripture is that all of those kings were evil kings, and they were wicked kings, and they continued to lead the people astray time after time after time. And it's actually in the midst of that context, in the midst of that nation, that we encounter Elijah. And so I want to help you understand a little bit of how bad it was in the midst of that. So in 1 Kings chapter 15, if you'll look at verse 25 with me, there was a guy named Jeroboam. So as the kingdom divided, Rehoboam, isn't that nice, the names? Don't name your kids these, by the way. If you're having kids, just Rehoboam, Jeroboam, not where you want to go. But Rehoboam took the nation of Judah, and Jeroboam actually is a guy that becomes king over the nation of Israel, and he leads the people astray. He leads them away from worshiping the God and God alone, all that kind of stuff. And then his son, verse 25 of 1 Kings 15, is a guy named Nadab. Again, don't name your kids this. Nadab, son of Jeroboam, began to rule over Israel in the second year of King Asa's reign in Judah. So just kind of giving you, and you're going to see this King Asa thing for several verses in the midst of this context. So King Asa is the king who's reigning in Judah. And then you're going to see all these other kings that are taking place in the nation of Israel. But it says this, but he did what was evil, verse 26, talking about Nadab. Nadab did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and followed the example of his father, continuing the sins that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit. Isn't that great? Then Baasha, verse 27, and I don't know, you can say these names however you want, by the way. Just say them and just go with it. It's okay. Son of Ahijah from the tribe of Issachar plotted against Nadab and assassinated him while he and the Israelite army were laying siege to the Philistine town of Gibbethon. Isn't that nice? Baasha killed Nadab in the third year of King Asa's reign, and he became the next king of Israel. And listen to what he does immediately. Immediately, it says, he slaughtered all the descendants of King Jeroboam, so that not one of the royal family was left, just as the Lord had promised concerning Jeroboam by the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh. So this guy becomes king. And as he becomes king, he slaughters. Now, the reason I want you to see this is because there's going to be some ways that it's described throughout this in terms of these kings doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And I want you to see how terrible it is. Number one, I don't think anybody in this room would like to live during this time frame. I don't think this would be a great time to live if you were a part of the nation of Israel. He did what was evil, verse 34 of 1 Kings 15, talking about Baasha. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight and followed the example of Jeroboam, continuing the sins that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit. He reigned for some time, right? But then it goes down, 1 Kings 16, verse 8. He has a son. His name is Elah, son of Baasha, began to rule over Israel in the 26th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. And he reigned in the city of Tirzah for 2 years. So Baasha had reigned for quite a while, and then his son takes over the throne. But listen to what happens. Verse 9, then Zimri, who commanded half of the royal chariots, made plans to kill him. Like, I wouldn't want to be king during this time either, you know what I'm saying? Made plans to kill him. One day in Tirzah, Elah was getting drunk at the home of Arza, the supervisor of the palace. Zimri walked in and struck him down and killed him. This happened in the 27th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. Then Zimri became the next king, and he killed, next verse, he killed the entire royal family of Baasha, leaving him not even a single male child. He destroyed distant relatives and friends so that nobody could rise up against him. But listen to what happens to Zimri. Zimri began to rule, verse 15, over Israel in the 27th year of King Asa's, but his reign in Tirzah lasted, get this, 7 days. How's that for you? That seemed like a whole lot of work for 7 days, you know what I mean? I mean, just a whole lot of work to make it for 7 days. It says this, the army of Israel was then attacking the Philistine town of Gibbethon. When they heard that Zimri had committed treason and assassinated the king, that very day they chose Omri, commander of the army, as the new king of Israel. So Omri led the entire army of Israel up from Gibbethon to attack Tirzah, Israel's capital. Listen to what happens to Zimri. When Zimri, who had been king for 7 days, when Zimri saw that the city had been taken, he went into the citadel of the palace and burned it down over himself and died in the flames. For he too had done what was evil in the Lord's sight. He followed the example of Jeroboam and all the sins he had committed and led Israel to commit. And Omri becomes king. And Omri, who was basically selected, becomes king. And it says this in verse 25, chapter 16. Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Even more, imagine this, even more than any of the kings before him. So think about it. I just want you to think about this context for a minute. Omri, to this point, is the king that is described to say that he has done more things, wicked and evil, than any of the kings that had gone before him. The kings who had plotted and killed entire families and friends. But Omri is the one who is described that he led the people farther and farther and farther astray. And he has a son. And his son, his name is Ahab. And maybe you've heard of Ahab before. But Ahab became the next king. And that's where we're going to pick up. 1 Kings 16, verse 29. Ahab, son of Omri, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. So all that's taken place, by the way, in the nation of Israel, there's been this one king in Judah at this point whose name is Asa during all of this stuff that's going on. And he reigned in Samaria for 22 years. But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Now remember what they said about Omri? Remember what they said about Omri, who had done more evil than any other king to this point, more evil than even the ones who had plotted assassination attempts and killed entire families, all the friends. And now they come to Ahab, and Ahab is the one, son of Omri, and now his description is he has done even more than any of the kings before him. So Ahab now is carrying this title that has been basically passed down from his father, that he is going to do more evil in the Lord's sight than any other king. And it goes on to say, as if it weren't enough to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, he marries this girl, and I hope that no girl in this place has the reputation. He married Jezebel. Oh, Jezebel. Now, Jezebel's mentioned, by the way. She's referred to in the book of Revelation. As we were going through the 7 churches of Revelation, they talked about that Jezebel. Well, Ahab marries Jezebel, not an Israelite, by the way, not a follower of Yahweh, doesn't have anything to do with God. In fact, it's said of her, it says she is the daughter, next verse, she's the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and he began, talking about Ahab, he began to bow down in worship of Baal. Now, Baal is this god of, by the way, this is a god of rain. You want to write that down somewhere. As you go through this, especially as we jump into this part with Elijah, you're going to want to understand that Baal is the god of rain. And so the way that it would work, and maybe you realize this, but maybe you don't, the way that it would work in this particular time is that if they were in need of rain, then they would worship Baal, and they would do things to try to please Baal in order for him to bring rain. And they'd the whole God system worked that way back then. It was like, if you needed a baby or you wanted to have a child, you'd worship the God of fertility, or you'd worship the God of the harvest. You'd worship all of those types, whatever it is that you wanted, you would try to do something in order to please that God, who would then bestow his favor upon you. And this is true of Baal. And so Baal was one of those gods, and the Israelites actually had been worshiping Baal at different times and different seasons throughout their history. But Ahab is the first one who is going to take it and really put it to a whole nother level in the nation of Israel. So much so, it tells us, first Ahab, it tells us, the next verse, he built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Doesn't that sound great? So this whole group of people that had been considered God's chosen people, that God had walked with, that they had been handed down from generation to generation to generation, all the stories of God's faithfulness, all the stories about God had provided, all the stories about how God had walked with them time and time and time again. And Ahab becomes king, and Ahab marries Jezebel, and Ahab decides that it would be better for us to build a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. And now enters the scene a guy named Elijah. In 1 Kings chapter 17, we're first introduced to Elijah, and this is what we know about him. Now, Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead. Now, let me just tell you right here, nobody's really sure of where this is. They're just not. Elijah essentially appears out of nowhere in the pages of history. They're not, they have some reference to maybe where it's at, but nobody knows exactly where this little town of Tishbe is. They're not 100% sure of who these people are, although they did exist. They just don't know much about them. And so, and let me just throw this out there. This is just free for you guys today that, listen, you might be thinking like, I'm a nobody. Guess what? So is Elijah. You might be thinking, God could never use me. I don't have this type of whatever. Nope. Here it is. Elijah appears on the scene of history from Tishbe in Gilead. Now, a couple of things that we might be able to gather about Tishbe. Tishbe is probably a place, and they were a people who were rugged outdoorsmen. And I don't know if any of you are rugged outdoorsmen, but I know some of you think you're rugged outdoorsmen. Some of you think you might be. Some of you boast about the fact that you were able to actually set up a tent outside and maybe sleep in it overnight, those types of things. Listen, that doesn't make you a rugged outdoorsman. Okay, it doesn't matter that you might be able to hunt and kill a deer and actually harvest all the meat off. That doesn't make you a rugged outdoorsman. But the people of Tishbe were rugged outdoorsmen from what we can tell. So much so the way that they would be described was they would be people that were very tan in nature because they were outside all the time. And then one of the ways that one commentator speculates, they're not 100% sure, they would talk about the people is they had this really tough leathery skin. So I don't know, anybody feel like you fall in that category in this room? I probably don't think so. So anyway, that's who they are. Tishbe, this land, Elijah's probably not one of those guys that you want to invite to family dinner. I imagine them being like one of my kids, and I'm not going to tell you which one of my kids, but I have one kid in particular that does not like to use utensils when we eat, and I don't know if you have any kids that are like that, but I imagine that's kind of like Elijah. These people from Tishbe, they might show up to dinner, and, you might make this nice plate of mashed potatoes and gravy and those types of things, and they're going to be like my son, and they're going to eat the mashed potatoes and gravy with their hands because that makes the most sense, right? That's what we're talking about in terms of Elijah. That's who he is. He's coming from nowhere, not refined, not skilled, probably not this great orator, can't speak a lot in terms of that, but he is going to stand before the king. And I start wondering, what kind of person does this? What kind of person would stand before the king? I mean, I didn't add up the years in here, but say you've got 38 years of kings who have basically been leading the people astray. And then Elijah shows up. Elijah, whose name means something along the lines of, my God is Yahweh, or the way that we might say it is, my Lord is God. And it speaks to me, it speaks to the fact that maybe he had some family heritage that held on to worshiping only Yahweh. That maybe, just maybe, Elijah grew up in a house whose parents would talk about the things of the Lord, whose parents would share with them all of the great things that God had done for the nation of Israel, who maybe in his life he got to this place where he had some fear of the Lord built into him. And basically it got to the place with Ahab as he built a temple to Baal in Samaria. And Elijah from Tishbe in Galilee, or Gilead, says, this is enough. And he shows up to the king and he says, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives. Now listen, one thing you don't say, Elijah doesn't say the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Nope, Elijah just decided to stand up. He says, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain, interesting, during the next few years until I give the word. Think about it. Baal is the god of rain. And Elijah stands, all the people starting to worship Baal, people starting to offer sacrifices to Baal. They think it's going to be great. There's going to be rain and there's going to be harvest and all of that. And Elijah stands up and he says, the God that I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. Now here's something I just want to challenge you with as you think about this in the beginning, this opening piece to Elijah and who he is. And it's this. We as a people, now, I don't know where you are in your faith. I don't know if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus. I don't know if maybe you're just one of those people that's got a lot of questions, those types of things. But if you are in this room a follower of Jesus, if you would say, listen, I've made a decision in my life that I am going to choose to believe in and follow Jesus, then you have a decision that you need to make. Because you can either choose in your life to blend in with everything that's going on around you, or you can choose to stand out. but you can't choose both. And Elijah, in this moment, he stands before the king. He enters the pages of history, and it's one of those things where he has the choice. He can blend in like everybody else in the nation of Israel who doesn't seem to care what's going on. Or he can stand up for the God that he believes in and therefore stand out from everybody else. But you know, you can't do both. You can't blend in. You can't be a secret Christian. You can't say, well, I'm going to follow Jesus, but only if it doesn't impact the people around me, because following Jesus should impact the people around you. And somewhere in the pages of history, you have to make the decision to say, I'm going to choose to stand up. And it's going to cause me to stand out, because blending in is no longer an option. And that's tough for a lot of us, by the way, because standing up and standing out could cost us. And the question becomes, what price are you willing to pay? And Elijah had to answer those same questions, by the way. And he stands before the king, and he says, there's going to be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. And honestly, these people are probably going, whatever. And listen to what happens. It says, then the Lord said to Elijah, go to the east and hide by the Kerith brook. Now, this would be a place of isolation. This would be a place of loneliness. This would be a place where he was away from everybody else. In fact, the very word means to be cut off. Nobody around him, and he goes there all by himself because he had declared this. And the Lord says, go here, and he says, near where it enters the Jordan River. It gives him a very specific place that he should go. And then he says this, he gives us some instructions. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food. How cool is that? And you might be going, I don't even know what you're talking about. Listen to what he says. The God that we serve, if you're a follower of Jesus, the God that we serve is the God who basically, even thousands of years ago, told some ravens to go feed a guy by the Kerith brook. And I don't know what you believe about God, by the way. I don't. But here's the thing that I want you to get to is, can you believe in a God like this? Can you believe in a God that's so much bigger and so much greater than you could ever imagine? So many of us are putting God in a box, aren't we? We want God to be according to our standards and God to be according to what we think God should do and God should be, and blah, 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 blah. And listen, can I just remind you, because maybe you've forgotten, because I know at times I forget, He's God and we're not. I don't know about you, but I don't think that I can train ravens to come and bring me food every day. I just don't think I can. But God tells Elijah, go by the Kerith brook, drink from it, and I'm going to send ravens to bring you food every day. And there's three things I want to just give you in this, and then one big takeaway. And the first one is this: God knows what's going on around you, so trust His plan. God knows what's going on around you. It's been interesting to listen to some people share some stories, even this morning, about this truth right here. And being reminded that God knows what's going on around you. I may not know it, and the person it's even sitting next to you right now or across the room, whatever, those types of things, they may not have any idea what's going on around you. But I can promise you this: God knows what's going on around you. So much so, there is nothing that has happened or will happen or is going to happen, any of those types of things in your life, that God doesn't know about. It's not as if God fell asleep and something happened and it's like, oh no! No, not at all. God knows what's going on around you. And not only that, but God has a plan. And I don't know if you really can understand the fullness of this, because I don't know that I can understand the fullness of this, but I know that in history, God has a plan. I know that in history, God is working and orchestrating and moving on behalf of His people and those who call Him by name. I know that there's nothing at all in this world that happens that takes God by surprise. Nothing at all. And I can rest in that. So I can rest in the fact that in my life, there's nothing around me that God didn't know about. There's no one around me. There's no circumstance that's going to come into my life that God doesn't know about, and that I can then rest in His plan. And this word trust is so hard for us, isn't it? Because we're not like people who are big on trust. In fact, we're people, I believe, as you look at it, we have a hard time trusting God because we're independent people. And like I mentioned before, so many of us, we want to put God in a box. And if God doesn't live up to our expectations and the things that we want, then it's one of those things where like, well, I can't trust him. But that's so not true. God knows everything that's happening in your life. You can trust him. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, probably a verse that so many of you are familiar with, says what? Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Right? All your understanding is, well, this is blah, 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 blah. No. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Stop leaning on you being able to figure this thing out. In all your ways, acknowledge him. Okay, God, that's living open-handed, isn't it? In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Why? Because he has a plan. He has a plan. He has a plan. So Elijah, verse 5 says, Elijah did as the Lord told him and camped beside the Kerith brook east of the Jordan. Did exactly what he said. The ravens, this is so cool. I don't know, what would you like for dinner? Some bread and meat would be really great. That'd be great. Okay. The ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. Now, if this were us, I'm just going to throw this out there because I know you guys are much like I am. If this were us, we would go, yeah, but what about lunch? I mean, if you're in my house, especially, that's the way my kids think. But the ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, and each day he drank from the brook. And I would just want to tell you this. God cares about you. So trust his provision. God cares about you. So trust his provision. This is that word, and I've shared this before. I mean, I think we hear all of our life, at least I know I have, and maybe you have, that God loves you, God loves you, God loves you. But I wondered if you know that because he loves you, he also cares about you. He cares about the things that are happening in your life. He cares about the diagnosis that you receive from the doctor. He cares about the fact that you may not have enough money to pay your mortgage or your rent or your utilities. He cares about the fact that you don't have a job lined up right now and you're still wondering what you're going to do. He cares about the fact that you open your pantry and there's not any food there, even though that may not describe many of us in the room. God cares about you. God cares about what's happening in your life. God cares about the fact that you have a broken relationship with someone. God cares about the fact that you hate your job and you don't know what to do. God cares about you. God cares about you. And he cares about those things. And he is providing for you in the midst of this. Now, I don't know where you stand, but my kids, they like to remind me of the difference between wants and needs. Right? And so when we think of God's provision, God is not necessarily going to give me everything I want, although that would be really cool. But he's going to give me the things that I need. And so with Elijah in this particular instance, Elijah is by the brook. He has water. And the ravens come in the morning. Could you imagine how neat that would be to get up in the morning and you didn't have any food? And then you got up in the morning and here comes the raven and he's bringing you some bread and some meat. And then he leaves. And you go through the day, by the way, all alone, all by yourself, in isolation, cut off from everybody else. Don't know what you do for the rest of the day. But then evening comes, and I don't know, what, maybe 5 o'clock, I don't know, 5:30, whatever time you might think you eat dinner, and here comes the raven bringing bread and meat again. And how great that would be to just be reminded of God's faithfulness. Now, the hours in between, you might struggle, but then that raven shows up, and you're like, oh, yes, I remember now. And the raven leaves in the evening, and you're all by yourself again and kind of wondering, but man, God is providing for the things that you need in your life. And guess what? He's providing for you for the things that you need in your life. Why? Because he cares about you. He cares about what's going on in your life. But then sometimes things change. And as things change, then we begin to question. So what happens next with Elijah? You get too comfortable, you get used to that, and then after a while the brook dries up. It's just getting good. It's like, this is great. You know, I got my water, the ravens are coming, I can count on it every day, every day, every day. And one morning, I don't know if it happened overnight, but let's just say it did. One morning you get up and it's gone. There's no more water. And I don't know if at that point the ravens stopped coming too, not sure, don't know. But after a while, the brook dried up. For why? For there was no rainfall anywhere in the land. And you and I begin to get to this place where we question. Well, God, why would you send me to the Kerith Brook, God, if all you were going to do was dry up the water? Why? And I wonder how much you realize the work that God is doing in your life. You see, God's working on you. This is the third thing. God's working on you, so trust his purpose. God's working on you, so trust his purpose. There's this verse in the New Testament. Paul wrote it in the book of Philippians, and it says this. Philippians 1:6 says, he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. He who began a good work, God, who began a good work in you, in your life, is faithful to complete it. And see, sometimes we go through those seasons and we wind up getting to this place where we are comfortable. We're comfortable because we've got the brook, and we're comfortable because we've got a raven that's bringing us food, and everything's great. But God says, you know what? I'm going to turn up the heat just a little bit on your life. You ever have that? Feel like it just gets a little bit hotter for you, and you realize, oh man, I don't like this. Because let's just be honest, man, the work that God is doing on you and in you and through all of those things, this is not an easy thing for anybody to go through in their life. Nobody's going, okay, God, bring it on. Bring me more. Give me more. No, we're not. We're looking at this. We're going, no. God, if I could just escape this, that would be fabulous. God, if you could just help this trial, this tribulation, this thing that came upon me, if you could just help it to go away, that would be perfect. But you know what? God's doing a work in your life. And you're much like I am, and you are a stubborn person. And you are rough around the edges. And God's got to chisel away some of that pride that you have, because it's the same pride that I have. God's got to peel away the fingers of your life because you're a control freak like I'm a control freak, right? You've got to be in control. And God's going, no. When you're following me, you've got to give up control. When you're following me, you've got to move your life from thinking you're independent, and you've got to move to this place of dependence on me. Why? Because God's working on you, and it hurts, and it's painful, but it's one of the most beautiful things that happens in your life. Because here's the truth of it. I don't know where you are, this season of life that you may find yourself in, but your season of pain, think about it, your season of pain, your season of suffering, your season of trial, your season of tribulation, whatever it is that you're facing, whatever it is that you're going through. And by the way, can I just tell you, like, there are some people who are going through some heavy, heavy things. And their season of pain is God's season of preparation. It's God's season of preparation. Because as you're going through those things, I started thinking about this idea of being forged in the fire. That your faith would be forged in the fire, that it would be molded and shaped in the fire that God is bringing on your life. It's almost like, I've mentioned this verse before, I continue to go back to it. I love this verse, 1 Peter 1:7, that says that these trials and this suffering has come upon you so that your faith of greater worth than gold, as though refined by fire, will result in the praise and honor and glory at the coming of Jesus Christ. He's looking at you and he's going, no. Your season of pain is God's season of preparation. And can I tell you one more thing about this that makes it so uncomfortable? Is your season of preparation requires you to be patient in the work that God is doing in your life. And there's not anybody in this room that I know of that welcomes patience with open arms. Yes, teach me more patience, God. Teach me more patience. Nope. But this is what it takes. What it takes for God to prepare you for what's next in your life, for this next place, this next season, this next opportunity, this next thing that he has for you is time in the fire so that your faith is being forged so that it will be able to stand against what's to come. Because what's to come for Elijah, and we're not going to get there today, and we're actually going to sort of skip over this part of it. But at the end of this chapter, Elijah makes his way to a widow's house. And now there's this oil and flour that never runs dry as she's able to provide for Elijah in the midst of this famine. Her son gets sick and he dies, and Elijah actually raises him from the dead. And then what we are going to talk about next week is Elijah stands in the pages of history against all of the prophets of Baal. And they're going to be on Mount Carmel, and they're going to have this standoff to determine whose God is God. And you don't get there without going through a season of preparation. And wherever God is taking you and leading you in whatever those things are in your life, you don't get there without going through a season of preparation. And I know those things aren't easy because it feels like you're all alone. They're not easy because there's so much pain that gets tied to it, but I can promise you this, that God working in you is a sign of his favor and his approval of what's happening in your life. It's not a sign of God's disappointment, as so many of us think. Because God works, and God moves, and God does things in preparation for people that he is going to use. A.W. Tozer said, if God is going to use you greatly, he must wound you deeply. And this happens in guys like Elijah, and it happens in the lives of so many people we know, because that's how God works. And listen, as we close, our prayer team's going to come down front, and they're just up here in the corners. And I just want to encourage you. I know there's some of you that have a heavy heart. You have a lot of things that are going on in your life, and this group of people, they're here week in and week out, and they're here to pray with you and for you and over you for those things. Maybe it's this season of pain that you're going through, and you just don't know what else to do. And these folks, man, they just love to put their hand on your shoulder and just pray with you in the things that you are facing in your life, because you don't have to go through those things all by yourself. Being a part of a family means that you've got people who are in your corner and on your side. Would you stand with me? I'm going to close in a word of prayer, and then our team's going to lead us. Father, thank you that you love us and care about us, and thank you that even in the midst of our pain and the things that we go through in our life, God, that you are preparing us for something even greater. And while we don't know what that is today, and we may not know what that looks like tomorrow or the next day or next year or even 5 years from now, God, we trust your plan and we trust your purpose. Because, God, we believe that you are so good and so kind and so loving. Thank you for sending Jesus for us. Thank you that it's in him that we have life and purpose. And it's in his beautiful, matchless name we pray.